Section 2, retribalization. Indigenous people, of course, did not vanish. Of course, Indigenous numbers had started to dramatically decrease when Europeans first arrived in the Americas. Europeans brought a whole series of different diseases, and Indigenous people didn't have immunities to these diseases, so they spread like wildfire. And it is quite controversial to really understand how many Indigenous people died when Europeans first arrived, especially after the first 100 years. Some people argue that it's as much as 90% of the Indigenous population of North America died after Europeans arrived within the first 100 years. Some people argue that it's only about 50%. In any case, that's a lot. So Indigenous people continue to die even after the first 100 years because new diseases were brought to the Americas, but also because they began to suffer from European colonization, warfare, poverty, loss of land. And the numbers of Indigenous people really bottomed out in the United States in the 1890s, right at the height of the so-called Indian Wars, when the U.S. government was had a policy of trying to exterminate Indigenous people on the Great Plains, or at least gather them onto reservations. But there was a big turnaround starting right in the 1900s, 1910s, and Indigenous numbers in the United States and in Canada and Mexico have dramatically risen ever since that time. So history as a discipline really became a weapon for redressing the imbalances inherent in victor perspectives, in victors telling the history, creating histories. So history as a discipline started to ask questions about different pasts of people who didn't have voices, pasts of people who were losers in historical equations. They started to ask questions about gender, class, ethnicity, and of course race in human history. They thought these things became very worthy of investigation. And as these histories became uncovered, they really changed the way people started to think about marginalized groups, both in the past and also in the present. So these changes to understandings of the past were really accompanied large-scale human rights movements, especially grounded in the United States and Canada and also parts of Europe, starting in the 1960s. Things like the feminist movement, the civil rights movement, and Indigenous activism really rose, and that was called Red Power. Now, of course, Indigenous people had been resisting European colonization ever since Europeans arrived, but they started to really gain new traction with the general public in the 1960s. Indigenous people had for a long time been trying to challenge colonization and also challenge broken treaties in Euro American court systems. But the courts had always given preference to the testimony of non-Indigenous people, including actually historians and anthropologists. And they gave this preference over the authority of tribal elders. Legal authorities discounted tribal perspectives, and they accepted at face value the first-hand written observations of European colonists. Mainstream historical perspectives thus put the onus on Indigenous societies to justify rights to use land, rights to hunt, Aboriginal rights. They had to justify these within colonial rules. So, both in the courtrooms and outside of them, Indigenous people were required to furnish Western style historical proof of their origins and their historic continuity on the land. So, tribal leaders and Indigenous scholars have tried to dismantle the myths that historians and politicians have perpetrated. And they're trying to revitalize Indigenous identities, especially those Indigenous identities that were demolished by war and trampled by dominant cultural politics. Hunani K. Trask is a leader in the fight for Hawaiian sovereignty. So she's an Indigenous Hawaiian person, and she's also a professor at the University of Hawaii. She explains, and I want to just show you this quote of hers: burdened by a linear progressive conception of history and by an assumption that Euro-American culture flourishes at the upper end of that progression, Westerners have told the history of Hawaii as an inevitable, if occasionally bittersweet triumph of Western ways over primitive Hawaiian Hawaiian ways. To know my history, I had to put away my books and return to the land. I had to feel the spirits of nature and take gifts of plants and fish to ancient altars. I had to begin to speak my language with our elders and leave long silences for wisdom to grow. But before anything else, I had to learn the language like a lover so that I could rock with her and lie at night in her dreaming arms. End quote. And that's from her book called From a Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii. Such Indigenous ideologies assert an Indigenous subjectivity, and they promote the themes of self-worth and cultural preservation. So these once powerless groups, powerless within a colonial setting, are finding ways to navigate the cultural tide that has so long run against them. So that tide took a big turn in the 1960s with this emerging proud Indigenous identity, and it's often called retribalization. And that's really threatened to upset this balance between mainstream and underdog histories. And it has really turned things around in historiography and made Indigenous history a subject worthy of study unto itself. And of course, that whole movement has made it possible for us to actually have this course called Ancient North America. So, one of the forerunners of retribalization is the practice of history. In the practice of history is what we call decolonizing methodologies. And actually, for our tutorial this week, we're going to be discussing Linda Tuwahi Smith, and we're going to be reading excerpts of her famous book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples. So Indigenous people achieving power over their own history has had tangible payoffs. Indigenous people in the United States and Canada do remain subject to federal policies, not just federal, actually other levels of government as well. And they also remain subject to public perception. So even though there have been these breakthroughs in academic disciplines and in some areas for the status of Indigenous people, they're still fighting incredibly difficult battles for equality. Real world problems for Indigenous people in North America include epidemic levels of poverty, suicide, despair, AIDS, rampant substance abuse, and these are all common symptoms of colonized people. So, nearly 20% of Indigenous deaths today are caused by alcohol, as compared to only 4.7% of the rest of the population in the United States. Indigenous people are tackling these issues and they're trying to rid themselves of dependence on outsiders. But economic development on reservations and off reservations, but in areas where Indigenous people live, remains very closely tied to politics. And it's intertwined with issues of sovereignty, tribal identity, access to resources, cultural issues, and ideology. So, of course, in Indigenous schools, Indigenous people are trying to use a curriculum to develop awareness of their own histories, and they're trying to empower their youth. So, by taking hold of public imagery, they're seeking to translate historical and cultural identities of their past into tangible political power. And probably one of the best examples of this that we can see today is the Idle No More movement. So even though red power arose in North America in the 1960s, Indigenous people have had to continue to fight today because they're still being subject to colonization. So the Idle No More movement arose deliberately to challenge this. So it began as a protest movement among some Indigenous women in Canada in December 2012, so a couple of years ago. And it's led to political actions in support of Indigenous people worldwide. And it's actually turned into a worldwide protest movement. So it was inspired by the hunger strike of Chief Teresa Spence, the chief of Attawapiskat. And you might remember Attawapiskat making headlines a few years ago, international headlines, because of its terrible level of poverty and horrible living conditions. generations. The I Don't Know More movement then was also inspired by Prime Minister Stephen Harper's legislative abuses of Indigenous treaty rights, especially in the recent omnibus bill, Bill C-45. So the I Don't Know More movement exploded on social media as well, especially on Facebook and Twitter. So its visions and goals are to protect water, air, land, and all creation for future generations.